Welcome to Work from the Inside Out, a podcast that highlights real-life stories, practical strategies, and best practices for transitioning your career from unhappiness and dissatisfaction to fulfillment, meaning, and joy. Now here is your host, career and executive coach, Tammy Guler-Loeb.
Hey everybody, I am so excited to introduce my guest today, Dave McKeown. Dave helps individuals, teams, and organizations achieve excellence by doing the ordinary things extraordinarily well. He is the CEO of Outfield Leadership and author of The Self-Evolved Leader. Elevate your focus and develop your people in a world that refuses to slow down, except during a pandemic, of course. Welcome, Dave.
Hey, Tammy, thank you so much for having me. It is just great to be here with you.
Well, it's great to have you, and thank you for joining us from your home office in Laguna Beach, California.
Indeed, sunny Southern California. It's hard to beat.
I know. I wanted to clarify that because I'm sure people are hearing your beautiful accent and wondering, ooh, where is he living? He's on the beautiful, beautiful Laguna Beach. So Dave, as you know, Work from the Inside Out, it's all about the kinds of changes and transitions that we make in our careers and our lives. And you know all about that. So take us back to some of your earlier years. And what are some of the things that you did in your life that perhaps informed where you are today?
Sure. I was born in Belfast in Northern Ireland. So far away from Laguna Beach, I guess. And I actually grew up at the back end of what was colloquially termed the Troubles in Northern Ireland.
Oh.
Which was essentially a long-running conflict over the sovereignty of Northern Ireland and whether it should remain as part of the UK as it was, or if it should become part of a united Ireland. And although I grew up in the tail end of that, what I was able to witness was essentially the negotiations around peace that were to lay the foundation for at least the next 10 to 15 years of peace in the country. Mm-hmm. And that was always a very interesting backdrop to grow up in, because for so long we had these leaders of these movements who were very much opposed to one another on a really staunch ground. There was a lot of literal fighting and violence, who then at some point decided that they needed to put down the violence and find a negotiated political resolution.
You were a kid at that time, right?
Yeah, I was. Yeah, I mean,
but you were aware of some of this, or did you witness some of this? Or
I was very much aware of it. So everybody's family at that time had known somebody or had been related to somebody who had been really deeply impacted by the Troubles. Either they were injured or they were killed. And my family was no different. There were people connected to us, at least historically. And there were a number of quite substantial terrorist, paramilitary killings and bombings that happened all throughout the first 13 or so years of my life. The big peace agreement was negotiated, I think, in 1997, called the Good Friday Agreement. And it was a weird, it was a strange context to grow up in, particularly because just looking at these so-called leaders of the community who had such contempt for each other, eventually realized that the common goal that they were all going towards eventually was a degree of peace and representation for all citizens of Northern Ireland. And so they had to put aside their tribalism to kind of come around the table and negotiate a deal. And it was by no means a perfect deal, as none of these things are, but it just twigged this real interesting perspective for me, which was, what does it really mean to actually be a leader and show up and put aside the things that you hold on to actually get to something that's in the greater good for everybody that you're serving. In this case, obviously the community, because they were politicians. And that was also coupled at the time with the fact that my father was a serial entrepreneur back in Northern Ireland, which was a very uncommon thing. There wasn't a lot of entrepreneurship happening in the backdrop of a lot of that violence. And so I think from a really young age for me, there was just this distilled notion of, what does it mean to get people to collectively put aside their differences to move towards something that's positive and good? And then also, I think for me, what does that mean to do that in an organizational context? What does it mean to actually get people, what does it mean to start a business, to grow a business, to scale a business, to lead a business? How can we bring characteristics of leadership, of helping people grow and develop and put it into a organizational setting? So from a very young age, although I didn't know this or hadn't put words around it, I think I just was always interested in, what does it mean to get people to buy into what you want to do in the direction you want to go with?
Yeah. Like I'm a baby boomer. I grew up during, the Vietnam War, and I remember war protests. And so there was a lot out there around, how are we going to find peaceful solutions to things? And even as a young child, I remember wondering, how can we end war? And, so I think I hear what you're saying about even being a child. And I'm guessing, well, clearly you grew up far, much closer to the unrest, obviously, than I ever did. But still that notion of being exposed to the idea of, how do we just get along?
Mm-hmm. And I think it's interesting because, you take any setting of trying to get two or more people moving towards a common goal. Obviously, the backdrop of conflict and war is way more devastating, and it's way more problematic, and it's got way bigger and grander issues. But at the end of the day, human nature is human nature. And so the approaches that you take to get agreement and solutions are the same no matter where humans are involved. And so, whether that's trying to negotiate a conflict or trying to negotiate your next, 5 years of your strategic plan, if people are not agreed around a common goal, you've got to find a way to get them there. And that was always the interesting thing for me. How do you get a group of people really to align around that common goal?
Well, and think about even groups of kids have to find their way there too, right? And I would imagine growing up in your home, watching your dad in some of the different businesses he was in, you might have been a witness to some of the different agreements he would come to, whether he was working with customers or other businesses. I don't know. I'm just guessing that was part of the mix for you.
Yeah, it was. I mean, I grew up around discussions of businesses and what it meant to start a business and grow a business. And actually, fun enough, he moved from entrepreneurship to starting a consulting company. And so then the discussions were around, how do you help other businesses do that? It was always really interesting whenever I was a kid in school, and teachers would say, well, what do your parents do? And most people in the room would be like, oh, my folks are doctors or firefighters or accountants or librarians or nurses and all of that good stuff. And I was like, what did I say? I asked my mom one day, what did I say? I think either she or my dad said, oh, your dad tells other people how to run their businesses. And I was like, oh, that's a really interesting perspective, interesting thing to say. And so it was always kind of around me. And that therefore then puts you in a position where, as you're beginning to carve out your own path, you ask yourself, well, what do I want to do with all of this? Yeah. And the traditional typical route at that point was, you go to high school, you go to college, you get a good job, and you work, and then you buy a house and you have 2 kids, and that's your life.
No, 2.3 kids, right?
2.3 kids. and And I was just never really sure whether that's what I wanted to do. I certainly wasn't that sure that I wanted to do it just because that's what everybody did.
Yeah.
It was kind of like, it wasn't like I was this massive rebellious child. I really wasn't. I was quite well behaved, but I always viewed the system as something that you could always work around. I would look at people and I would think, there's always a faster, better, or a quicker way to do that or get to where you want to go through, rather than just having to go through all of those steps. And so I've sort of always had this perspective of in crafting my own life. How can I take what's there and actually leapfrog it or go around it, or what's the smartest way to do it? And so I actually didn't go to college for, I think, 2 years after I graduated high school. I did a bunch of traveling and did some voluntary work and, found myself, I guess, and just sort of went against the grain a little bit in that regard.
When you say you went against the grain, whose grain were you going against? Were your parents disappointed, or did anybody tell you, oh, this is wrong what you're doing? Or
my parents were pretty good. They were pretty open. They did take this sort of perspective that was, so long as you're happy, then we're happy. When push come to shove, my mother, and by the way, by the time I got to high school and college, my parents had separated, so it was two separate conversations that I was having. When it push come to shove, my mother was way more in that bracket than my father was. My dad was fine with me taking 1 year to go explore, and then whenever it came to the second year, that was definitely a lot more.
He was getting worried about you, huh?
yeah, at that point, and very much trying to steer me in another direction. But not just my parents, but even just the groups of friends that I grew up with, and what all of the school teachers would tell you that's the route. You've got to go get educated right away, and just there's this sense of like narrowing your focus until. Yes. And then you can end up, 45, 50, 60 years, and you've narrowed so much because that's been the route that you've been pushed down.
Yeah.
And I remember when I was evaluating all of the options, my stepmother at the time said to me, I'm supportive of whatever it is that you choose to do, but here's a bit of advice that somebody gave me. She said, when you're making a life choice like this, make sure that you leave more doors open than you close. And so if you're going to take a route that's different or not what the anticipated route is, like make sure that it leaves you more open, so that you don't narrow your focus in a different way just because you're going against that. And I think that bit of advice really helped guide and steer me in those stages of my life. And in fact, beyond that, and I use it quite often as a touch point for decision making in my life.
At what juncture did she give you that piece of advice? Do you remember?
I think it's been a couple of times, but I think the first time was when I was coming to the end of the equivalent of being a senior in high school, and I was seriously considering not going to college. And she said, just whatever you do, make sure you keep more doors open. And whenever I evaluated taking a couple of years off to do some volunteer work, to do some traveling, it felt like I was not closing things off completely.
Yeah.
And actually, at the end of the day, after a couple of years, I did then come back and I did do, took a degree and enjoyed it immensely. But
probably
I think
more than you would have if you had just gone right out of high school.
I think so. Yeah. I was able to be very intentional about what I studied, why I studied, where I studied it. And I think it stood me in good stead.
Did those 2 years you were traveling and doing volunteer work, do you think that what you did during those 2 years influenced the kinds of choices you made about what you studied?
I think yes and no. I think it further solidified my belief and understanding of the connectedness of humanity and the great things that can be accomplished by people who buy into common goals and who are able to engage with each other in adult relationships. I spent time in LA, in California, in Australia, in India. I spent a little time in Africa a little later in my life, and it really continued to pull at a thread of that's inside of me around my purpose or destiny around helping people develop and grow into a better version of themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So all of the leadership consulting that I do at the minute, the strategic planning, leadership development work, it's all focused around helping individuals grow and develop into a better version of themselves. And
Mm-hmm.
and I think some of the voluntary work that I was doing at the time was laying a flame or certainly tugging at a string of that being a purpose that I wanted to pursue.
How did you find that volunteer work? What were there programs that you did, or did you just show up in places and say, "Hey, you need some help"?
It was mostly, well, there were a couple of different ways. Mostly it was programs that were available. Whenever I was younger, I was quite involved in my local church. And so there were a bunch of international programs that they were able to connect me with.
I see.
Which was great. And then some of it was just self-found. So actually through one of those programs, I made a really good friend with a guy in Australia, and then went over and spent 3 months with him, building out some programs out there. And it was a really formative experience, and actually, proved to me not only that string about that thread of purpose that I had, but also just give me some of the fundamental understandings of what it meant to show up and put in a hard day's worth of work.
Yeah.
And, but funny enough, so there's very much that formative aspect of it. But then there was the layer of, I ended up studying business and management. So there was the layer of, okay, how do we take this concept, this construct of helping people grow and develop? And I did actually consider going down a more of a nonprofit route and operating there.
Yeah.
But my interest was a little bit more aligned with how do I make that happen in a business setting? How do I make that happen for folks that are, just turning up every day and working? And that thread then has been pulled throughout the rest of my career.
Yeah.
So, now I get excited helping folks that are putting in good work every day, but feel like there's something more for them and they want to grow and develop into it.
Mm-hmm.
I think that media and society has sort of fed us this lie that says, if you're not some sort of visionary entrepreneur, if you don't have a side hustle, or if you're not pursuing another dream outside of the corporate world, and you're somehow not fulfilling your purpose. And I don't think that's necessarily true. I meet plenty of people who are born to lead people within the construct of an organization. And so my then focus to help people grow and develop, then move towards, well, how do we make that happen?
Right. And so your interest in people and helping them to grow, and I think this idea of, how do they find common ground too? There was never any thought on your side about maybe studying psychology or something like that. Did you ever think about becoming a social scientist in any way?
Well, funny enough, technically my degree was in the social sciences, just by the de facto of where business and management sat within.
Oh, really?
The University of Glasgow that I went. Yeah. So I have a social sciences degree, and it did allow me to take some base level, I wouldn't say it was quite psychology, but certainly behavioral economics courses that draw heavily from psychology. Uh-huh. I don't know whether it had completely, the light bulb had gone off in my mind at that stage that there was such a such a connection between the two things. But I definitely flirted around the edges of it a little bit.
Yeah. I was just curious. So you went to school, you studied business, and really looked at that through the lens of the human perspective. And where did you land after you finished?
So during the summer months of my studying, I spent my time out in the North Shore of Massachusetts, where my father was living at the time, interning in quotation marks for him. He was a solo consultant at the time. And I did that for a couple of reasons. One, it was a route to further experience what the world of just consulting and leadership training was like, because that's what he did. But also it was a way to build a bridge and strengthen a relationship with him. But he had moved away from Northern Ireland whenever I was a teenager, and so we hadn't had a lot of bonding time. And so spent my summers doing that. Really, really loved the work that he did. He was working with senior executive teams, helping them essentially scale their business. And so coupled with my, at that point then, academic journey, there was this coming together of a career. And at the end of all of that, I said to him, so this is great. I've graduated. I've spent all of these summers interning with you. So where's the job? Let me come work with you. And he rightfully so. One of the few bits of advice he gave me that was good was, if you come work for me now, you're only ever going to be known as my kid. He's like, go work for somebody else for a while and get something underneath you. So I actually went and worked for a big global IT consulting company back in the UK, which was very different to a lot of the things that I had been feeling that I wanted to move and grow in. But I did it for a couple of reasons. One, just to get experience of something that's a little bit more structured, a little bit more bureaucratic, dare I say. And also just to learn some basic skills around consulting and what that meant and what that looked like. And so I was there for a number of years in the UK, really enjoyed it, had a really good experience, but there was always just this sense, this feeling that like, I'm just this cog in this bigger wheel.
Yeah. Well, you probably were.
And so after,
it gave you that view, right, of what goes on in a lot of organizations. And so, fast forward to, the kinds of clients you work with now, even if you're working with different kinds of companies, different size companies, I would imagine that a lot of the clients you work with may have also come out of similar environments. And so when they know that you have been there and done that, they can feel a little bit of a kinship with you, or you have a context in which to understand why people might do some of the things they do, or why they look at things through a certain lens. You have that context. So I could see where that would be very valuable. And it sounds like, it's nice to hear that you found it even somewhat enjoyable in some ways, because some people come out of those early experiences kind of traumatized sometimes.
Yeah. And, it was funny. I did really enjoy it, and I think it was very valuable. And like I said earlier, I think for some people, they find their home in larger organizations, and that's great and fantastic. It just wasn't home for me.
Yeah.
But I think your point's absolutely right. As I look back on my career to date, and the breadth of industry and different types of organizations that I've had the pleasure and privilege of working with and for, has meant that there are a great number of circumstances I can stand into, and I can at least have a base level conversation of understanding of what that's like. And it's a really powerful tool to be able to pull out, because it helps you create connections with folks, because they say that one of the first things that we look for in new interactions is there a degree of commonality here. And so I'm always looking for what's the one thing that I can connect to with this person, and what can we talk about that connects us. So I would probably do it again, and I would definitely not advise against it for anybody else.
Yeah. It's kind of a training ground, I think, for a lot of people.
It is very much so. And also it continued to pique my interest on how do you take something that's a very structured system and push it and try to go around it as you can. Funny enough, at this stage in my development, I'd had 2 years before college. I also graduated into the Great Recession. And so they kicked my start date back by, I don't know, it was about a half a year. So I was actually starting with folks that were 2-3 years junior to me. And most of the folks that I had grown up with were now 3-4 years into their education, which, in the grand scheme of things isn't a lot, but whenever you're in that position, feels like it's everything. So I'm seeing all of my friends getting their first promotions or even second promotions. And so I was very intentional about it. I was like, I'm going to go in, I'm going to ensure that I get into a role, and I'm going to do whatever I can to get promoted as fast as I can. And that was what I did. I would just work real hard and develop the relationships that I needed to make that happen.
Yeah. How long were you there for?
I was there for 3 years in total.
At what point did you decide it was time to move on?
Well, at about the 2-year mark, my father, who had told me that I would never work for him, I don't think he ever said never, but certainly said, "You're not going to come work for me right out of college."
Right.
Called me up and said, "Hey, I'm actually, I'd love to think about having you come out and join me." And so that was a route back into that smaller world of consulting and kind of that first job, I guess, that I'd had where I'd really connected with what it was that we were doing. And it was a tough decision. I was living in the UK at the time, and it would have required a relocation to the United States. And that was a hard thing to think about. There were a whole bunch of personal things that went into that decision. And but ultimately, I said this. I drew up a pros and cons list. You know, if I stay here and work through the path that's here, and it was a great path. You know, I could see in 10 or 15 years where I could get to, and what that would mean. And there was a lot of risk with the other side, but I could see where that would take. And you know, for me, it was like, it was more about what I stood to lose by not doing the slightly more risky thing than I would have stood to gain by sticking in the slightly more secure place that I was in. And you know, I'm always up for an adventure.
That's an interesting point, though, I think, because I think that a lot of people take the safe route. You know, and I don't say that as a criticism. I think there's good reasons to do that. However, a significant percentage of those people end up knocking on my door. You know, let's say symbolically, because obviously they can't all knock on my door, but they do, because they take the safe route and then they find themselves feeling either kind of stuck because they've reached a certain pinnacle, you know, a certain level of income and status and lifestyle. And then really, they're so tired. They're so tired of it. And it's not doing it for them. I've seen it so many times. So good for you for doing what you did. You know, that you really, you know, your instincts were there already to do that kind of thing. But I think a lot of people would look back on a time like that and would wished they had, you know? So I'm hoping that some of the people listening to this, no matter what stage of life you're at, listen to that voice that says, come on, take a chance, you know?
Yeah, I think
you're not gonna let yourself down. Take a chance.
It's funny because whenever I go back to that point, whenever I made that decision, that one statement that my stepmother had made previously, which was make sure you leave more doors open than you close.
Yeah,
it was funny because when I looked at the, let's call it the more safe, secure option, which was stay in the job that I was at, you know, stay in my home country where I've got a support network, where I've got friends. In doing that, I actually felt like that if I was to do that, it would have closed more doors for me. Whereas the other option, although it was unknown what those doors were, I just knew that there would be more there. And, you know, I also understand that I had the fortune of being relatively young at that time and being new into my career. And it's much easier for me 15 years removed from that decision to say, oh, well, wasn't that a great decision? Well, yeah, but I hadn't gone down a route that I had to then backtrack from too much. You know, I did have to make some difficult decisions, and, you know, I left some personal relationships behind and shifted the country that I lived in, and, you know, altered the cadence with which I would see my mother and my grandparents, and all of that was stuff that I had to consider. But I can only imagine what it's like to wake up 20 years, 30 years, 40 years down the line and to feel trapped then, because you've already made those decisions, and now you've got to find a way to engage in something that excites you and enthuses you at that point.
Well, I mean, there's another way to look at that too, just for the sake of conversation, let's say, and that is that you could have had this, you know, you could have had your father make this offer to you, and it could have just been that would have been the pivot point for you, where you would have said to yourself, this has really given me pause to think about what's next. And while I don't necessarily want to pick up and leave everything I have here in the UK, because I have some things here I really don't want to walk away from, it is time for me to move on to something else.
Mm-hmm.
And you could have taken another path. It just may not have been over to the US, I mean, I'm not saying, oh, see, you could have done something else. But I think it's the idea that I think sometimes people think in, it's either this or that, and there's no other options. It's like, just like your stepmother said, leave the doors open. Well, guess what? There's more than two doors.
Right.
So it's possible your father opened up a door. It doesn't mean that there weren't other doors you could have opened at that point. I think sometimes, though, people limit their thinking around what's possible. Mm-hmm. And, it's just you reach a juncture where there's an opportunity, and maybe you could have thought of something else and said, you know what? This just triggered my need to make a change. It doesn't mean that I have to throw out, as they say, the baby with the bathwater. I don't know where that came from, but you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's great. And funny enough, I think that as I now 15 years after that experience, and now that I'm in the life that I'm at, where I do feel more settled and more comfortable where I am here, and less likely to make a huge wholesale change again.
Yeah.
I'm now starting to view my life more in those incremental changes. So when something does open up as a frustration or something that I'm not happy with or something that I'm not comfortable with, you don't have to, go and change your life in its entirety, but you become very intentional about those things that you can and should change.
Exactly.
I think the greatest disservice that folks do for themselves is when they find themselves in a situation that they don't like, rather than either just saying, I don't like this, I'm going to change it, or I don't like this, but you know what, change is too hard, so I'm just going to put up with it. They take this third option, which is, I don't like this, I'm not brave enough to change it, or I don't want to change it, but I also don't want to admit that I'm actually quite comfortable staying here, so I'm just going to stay in this situation and kind of complain about it and moan about it. And that's such a disservice that you're doing to yourself and people around you.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of people, I think what you're describing is people get comfortable with their discomfort.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's their comfort zone. It's like, that expression, better the devil you know than the devil you don't know. Right.
Right.
What we're talking about here also does remind me of your book, The Self-Evolved Leader, Elevate Your Focus and Develop Your People in a World That Refuses to Slow Down. And what's interesting about that is that there's a lot of pieces in your book that actually do encourage leaders to take an incremental approach, to slow down enough to be intentional, to think about what they're doing, both in terms of their own self-discovery as leaders and in their own, in the ways in which they develop the people who report to them. And there's a ton of examples in your book about that. This book is amazing. I recommend it highly to anybody who is, and thank you for sending it to me. I highly recommend people who are interested in growing as a leader, whether you are a new manager or an aspiring leader, or you are deep into leadership. There's a lot of things in here that can really help you, I think, reset and refocus your leadership approach. I think give you a chance to try some new things, develop some new muscles, and it feels like there's something for everybody in here. And it's a very practical book. And what I like about it also is that you can, even though the book is a very organized book, you can follow it in order. And I know it's designed in that way to really kind of follow it in order and go through the chapters. There's something that you can do almost immediately. You know, some books you read about leadership or you read about these practices, but you can't always sort of take them into the workplace and apply them right away. And what I liked about this was there's nothing in this book that you can't start to implement right away or start to work with right away. It's very tangible. It's a very hands-on kind of tool. And I just really appreciate that. And it's almost like it's almost like a textbook and a workbook all in one. I could easily see this being a text for some classes.
Thank you, Tommy. Actually, I turned up to do a Q&A for a MBA program in Holland the other week, and they used it for a text on one of their courses on ethical leadership. So it absolutely can be used in that way.
Perfect.
You know, I had a little note card in front of me whenever I wrote it that said, between the philosophical and the practical lies progress. And that was kind of what I wanted to put into the DNA of the book. I wanted it to cause people to think in a slightly different way, but I also didn't want it to have to then release, 2 years later or 12 months later, the field book or the guidebook to how to implement everything that was in that first book. I wanted to give folks the ability to take away and put 2 or 3 things into place in immediately. And, I think your point about anybody at any level being able to put in place what's in there. I see so many leaders that are stuck in mid-level positions that complain about the circumstances around them and why they couldn't do a certain thing and why they can't lead in a certain way. And I wanted to dispel that as much as possible. So I wanted to say, it doesn't matter what the culture of your organization is, you can still take this and put it in place with your team. You don't need permission from your boss. You don't need the culture to be different. Just grab it, go with it, and see the difference.
Oh, the one thing that, well, there's many things in here, but one thing that I wanted to talk with you about here, of many, is all about the idea of team flow and the whole notion of flow that you talk about in your book. And this notion of, I coach a lot of leaders and executives, and one of the things that they struggle with a lot is delegating, empowering other people to do things. Even though they hire great people, there's just these things that they won't let go of, and they just won't let someone else take it on. And so they take it all on themselves, and then they're up till all hours of the night, or they just allow themselves to take on a huge workload. And I love some of the solutions or some of the strategies that you suggest about how to really start to kind of unpack that or unload some of that. One of the things you talk about is, conducting a joint triage. And maybe you could talk about that a little bit, because I think, and how to start to develop that more collaborative or trusting relationship amongst people, because I think people are hungry for that, both the people who are reporting to someone and the people who are supervising them. I think they're desperately hungry for that. And yet then there's the situations where people feel like things are being dumped on them without any regard for what they already have on their plate. And so I just love some of the language that you came up with. So I like this sort of joint triage theme.
Thanks. And the first thing that you've got to recognize about delegation is that it's almost entirely exclusively an ego issue with the leader. The reality is, and I've had many conversations with leaders where they say, I struggle with delegation because, I'll only have to come in and clean up after, or, it'll take them twice as long as me, or it just won't be good enough. And to which I'd look them in the eye and say, so you're genuinely telling me that the person that's in the role that should be able to handle this job can't handle it? And they say, well, yeah. And I go, well, then that's that's a completely different issue. They shouldn't be in the role. You need to go and find somebody else. Why are they, honestly, if that's truly the thing, and that's a performance issue for them, is a very different discussion. The reason that people don't delegate is because it all stems to their ego. It essentially, when we take on those acts of heroism of holding all of that work and saying and convincing ourselves that nobody can do it as well as I can,
right?
We're self-validating or giving our need. It helps us tell us that we are needed, wanted, useful, and valuable to the team.
Right.
Which is a misconception about where the value that you bring to your team as a leader is. It's not in doing that stuff. Right. It's actually the value you bring is in being able to elevate your focus so that you can think about the medium and long-term direction of your team and your development of your people. Because if you're just in the weeds with your team all day, every day, nobody's growing, nobody's developing, and you don't have a medium and long-term direction that you're going in. And so I say all the time, write down your to-do list and now go find a way to delegate 80% of that. You should be left with 20% of your to-do list. Now here's the thing. Here's the question that you ask for each item on your to-do list. Is there somebody who on my team who, if I give them a little advice, guidance, coaching, and support along the way, could do this? If the answer is yes, you got to go do it. It's not saying that it's just going to, they're magically going to be able to do it exactly the way that you want. But we often have too much subjectivity into the quality of an output of something. And so, and we don't want to take the time to provide advice, guidance, and coaching because we believe that it takes longer to do the task.
That's the biggest thing I hear all the time.
And then you got caught in a trap. So once you've made that commitment, one of the things that you need to do then is handle that transmission of, here's a thing I want you to do for me. Because this is usually the other side of this equation is a leader comes to somebody on their team and says, hey, have you got time? Can you do this thing for me? 95% of the time, the person's going to say, sure. Yeah. Even if they're, up to their eyeballs in other stuff, because nobody wants to say, no, I can't do that because that makes me feel like I'm incompetent. So the answer is sure. Leader says whatever it is that they want to have happen. And then the person's left there going, well, okay, I guess I'll just squeeze this in somewhere. A much better way to do it is to approach somebody and say, hey, I've got something I'd love for you to do, but I want to ensure that you've got, bandwidth or whatever word or terminology you use in order to take this on. Can I share this with you? And then can you let me know what's on your plate? It takes 5 minutes longer. Right. You share with them what you think the task is and what you think or the time is. And then you get them to say, hey, you know what? Here's everything else on my plate. That'll flag up one or two things. One, gives you the opportunity to actually, often whenever those conversations happen, there's 2 or 3 things that are in there that you're thinking, I don't even know why that's on your plate anymore. Exactly. That's something you need to delegate, or we got to find another way to do that. Right. And that discussion hasn't happened because people just hold the work for themselves. So it gives you this opportunity to help your team prioritize what's on their own list. Right. And it also makes them feel more contributing to the process of that delegation. So it's like those old, modems. The modem would go, I'm a modem, I want to talk with you, and the other modem will go, oh, I'm a modem too, let's talk. and there's this sort of like connection of like, okay, we can make this happen, rather than like what a lot of leaders do is they just lob things over and hope somebody will catch it.
No, I think you're right. I like that. The idea of even having that sort of triage conversation is it actually develops a level of awareness about what's actually even happening, and when people feel seen and heard, so many times I hear people say, my boss doesn't even know what I do half the time. And if their boss would come to them and say, look, I want you to do this thing, let's talk about what's already on your plate, they would love to be seen and heard.
Yeah, very much so. And
have that strategic conversation and be given a chance to take something else on that's more, high priority.
Yeah, I think so.
And I love it.
The other interesting thing, though, just to push back a little bit on that, not taking specific circumstances into consideration, but often when somebody says, my boss doesn't even know what I do, that's a two-way street. Oh, yeah, they may not, the boss might not be coming having those discussions, but clearly you're not having them either. So have you got your weekly one-on-one booked in? Have you got your top 3 priorities? Are you talking through with them? Are you share, and normally the answer is, well, no, because they wouldn't be interested anyway. And it's like, well,
no. No excuses. No
right.
excuses. Yeah, I'm with you. That's the first thing I say to someone when they say to me, well, my boss doesn't know what I do. I say, well, did you tell him? Have you? It's a two-way street here. I don't want to hear any victim stuff here. You have a voice. If you want them to know what you're up to, you've got to speak up. It goes both ways. Absolutely. So let's fill in the middle blank here a little bit, and we're going to wrap up soon, but I want to make sure we fill this in now. So you came over to the States, you made this big decision, and you worked for your dad or worked with your dad for a while. And, now you're in Laguna Beach and you've written this great book, but there's something that must have happened in the middle there, which we didn't even get to.
A couple of things happened. I moved across the country with, at the time, my girlfriend, now my wife, a wonderful woman called Paris. I got fired by my father. Yeah. And then was left with another pivotal choice. What do I do at this point? But
just not as a son, just for as a worker, I hope.
Well, I mean, that has implications on other aspects of the relationship, clearly.
We won't go into that. That's a different podcast.
Yeah, that's a different episode for a different day. And then I had to decide what I wanted to do at that point. Did I want to continue in the type of work that I was doing before that I really loved, but have to do it on my own? Or did I want to go back to a bigger consulting company? Or did I want to go in-house and do something else? And ultimately, I decided that I loved what I did a lot. And so, writing the book was part of my own plan for the promoting and getting out the work that I do on a day-to-day basis.
So the book came out in 2020, and tell us about Outfield Leadership.
Yes.
Which has nothing to do with baseball, by the way.
It doesn't, no. So, yeah, Outfield Leadership was named for a bizarre reason that I'll not go into. But anyway, I made the decision after parted ways with my father in that business that I wanted to keep doing what I was doing. And so set out a little stall on my own called Outfield Leadership, where I now do two things. I do strategic planning with senior executive teams, help them set and achieve their strategic growth goals. And then I do leadership training and coaching to help the leaders that are supposed to implement those strategic plans grow and develop the mindset, skill set, and behavior in order to do that. The book came out January 2020, which was a terrible time to release the book.
Right on time, right?
Yeah, it was great. And I had this whole plan that I was going to, hit the speaking circuit and promote the book, and it was going to be great. And then I got locked in my room. But having said that, it's been a fun year in promoting the book and getting it out there. And I've had a lot of just really fun conversations with great people like you, and had great opportunities, like I mentioned, speaking to the MBA group last week, and do a lot of my business virtually at the minute, starting to see things come together in person a little bit more, where we're at now. And I'll continue with that thread of helping people grow and develop into the best version of themselves in whatever setting I find myself.
That's great. Well, Dave, this has been enlightening and interesting. And we will have all the links to tell us how people can find you. How can they best find you?
Sure. You can either go to outfieldleadership.com or davemckeown.com. And the book is available on Amazon. There are links on both websites to the book. I'm also pretty active on LinkedIn and Twitter, Dave McKeown, on both of those.
Great.
You can find me there, or you can find me sitting behind this desk in Laguna Beach.
Or on the beach, right?
Or on the beach, yeah.
Well, Dave, thanks so much for being here today, and thanks for sharing your story. It's been really interesting, and thank you for writing this great book. I think it's going to serve a lot of people really well.
Thank you, Tommy. Thank you for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
I hope you enjoyed my interview with Dave McKeown. It was so interesting to speak with him about his professional transitions. What is your key takeaway from our interview? If you are interested in any of the resources or links mentioned in today's podcast, you can find them on the blog page of my website at tammyglulerloeb.com. Just look for episode 141. Are you thinking about what your next professional move is going to be? Maybe perhaps you're feeling a little stuck or a little afraid. Stay tuned for my new book, Work from the Inside Out. Break through 9 common obstacles to design a career that fulfills you. It will be available in November 2021 in print and digital ebook editions through my website, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and independent bookstores. If you are inspired by this episode with Dave, please share it with your friends and colleagues. And please do subscribe so you don't miss next week's show. Remember, subscribing is always free. Are you enjoying the podcast? I'd so appreciate your review on Apple Podcasts. It's easy to find through my website at workfromtheinsideout.com. Just click on the Apple Podcast button and follow the instructions provided there. Thanks so much for listening, and remember, it's never too late or too impossible to find your sense of fulfillment and satisfaction in your work and other meaningful activities. I'd love to hear how it's going for you. Feel free to drop me a line. Bye for now.
Thank you for listening to the Work from the Inside Out podcast. For more information, you can find us at www.workfromtheinsideout.com.